Imagine cruising across America in the mid-1970s, when highways stretched endlessly and motorcycles were often raw, loud, and punishing for long rides. Then along came the Honda Gold Wing GL1000 in 1975, a machine that felt like it came from another universe. It wasn't just a motorcycle, it was a revelation with liquid cooling, a flat four-engine and shaft drive that whispered instead of shouted. Riders who had grown used to vibrating seats and numb hands suddenly had the option to glide through states in comfort, carrying luggage and even listening to music once accessories became common. The GL1000 introduced an entirely new way of thinking about what motorcycling could be, more about the journey than the fight against fatigue. It put freedom and endurance into one package, challenging not only rivals but also the very definition of a motorcycle. That shockwave rippled through dealerships, clubs, and households, reshaping riding in a way that was as controversial as it was magnetic. In a world that saw bikes as either commuter tools or adrenaline machines, the Gold Wing asked a bigger question. What if a motorcycle could take you farther, smoother, and safer than you ever thought possible? That's the story we're going to unpack today. And if you're enjoying this dive, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what legendary machine you'd like to see next. When the Honda Gold Wing GL1000 arrived in 1975, it disrupted expectations from the first glance. This wasn't a stripped-down cafe racer or a chrome-heavy cruiser. It was a liquid-cooled touring powerhouse with a horizontally opposed four-cylinder engine. That engine choice alone set it apart in a market dominated by air-cooled inline-fours and V-twins. Honda's decision spoke volumes about its ambition. This was a motorcycle built not for sprints, but for marathons. Riders wondered, could this truly change how Americans thought about crossing long distances? The early reactions hinted at both fascination and skepticism, a split that would define the GL1000's first chapter, microstory. In the Midwest, one rider set out to test the GL1000 on a weekend loop through several states. Normally, such a trip meant sore wrists, fuel stops every 100 miles, and buzzing engines that left ears ringing. With the Gold Wing, he found himself cruising steadily, carrying gear without compromise and arriving refreshed enough to consider turning around for another loop. It wasn't just a ride. It was a redefinition of endurance. Stories like his spread through magazines and word of mouth, fueling curiosity for a machine that seemed to rewrite the script. Context Digest. Touring motorcycles weren't new in 1975, but none had been purpose-built with such focus on smoothness and reliability. Many riders cobbled together aftermarket fairings, saddlebags, and backrests to make do, but Honda delivered a platform designed to embrace these additions. The GL1000 didn't ship with all the luxuries yet, but its engineering signaled a future where comfort and distance were no longer afterthoughts. That anticipation created a sense of momentum, as if something larger was brewing in the riding world. Reflection Bridge. This wasn't just about a new bike. It was about Honda daring to define a category on its own terms. Microstory. Consider the California coast, where highways and mountain passes test both man and machine. Riders who tackled the Pacific stretch with the GL1000 discovered that the shaft drive reduced maintenance demands, while the flat four's balance made it feel planted at speed. Instead of fighting the road, they could savor it. For many, this was the first time a motorcycle felt like it could match the effortless cruising of a grand touring car. Those experiences turned skeptics into converts, and the Gold Wing's reputation began to spread beyond the pages of advertisements. Context Digest. The engineering of the GL1000 was as much about restraint as innovation. Honda didn't overload it with gadgets at launch. Instead, they delivered a solid, refined machine with clear upgrade potential. The aftermarket responded immediately, producing windshields, saddlebags, and even radio systems. This partnership between the factory foundation and the aftermarket creativity allowed each rider to shape their own version of the ultimate touring machine. In a sense, the Gold Wing was both a motorcycle and a canvas. Microstory. In small-town America, bike nights at local diners became an unlikely stage for the Gold Wing. Surrounded by rumbling cruisers and flashy sport bikes, the GL1000 often drew curious stares for its understated styling. Riders would gather around, asking about the water cooling and the shaft drive, features that seemed exotic compared to what they knew. The owner, often fresh off a long ride, would talk about covering hundreds of miles without the aches that everyone else accepted as inevitable. These conversations planted seeds. Motorcycling could be something more than noise and short bursts. Reflection Bridge, the Honda Gold Wing. GL1000 wasn't just another model release. It was a cultural wedge, opening space for a new type of rider identity. Context Digest. By the late 1970s, the Gold Wing had started to cultivate a dedicated following. Clubs formed around its unique strengths, with rallies centered not on burnout contests or speed trials, but on distance rides and shared journeys. That culture shift was profound. Motorcycling communities that once thrived on rebellion and bravado now had a counterpart built on endurance, fellowship, and the joy of arriving together after hundreds of miles. This balance between performance and practicality created a richer, more diverse riding landscape in the US. The Honda Gold Wing GL1000 had proven it could attract riders who valued comfort without sacrificing credibility. As the decade turned, the motorcycle stood at a crossroads. Would it double down on its touring identity or risk being absorbed into the broader mix of performance machines? That tension set the stage for the next wave of evolution. The Honda Gold Wing GL1000 in its early years had already proven it could transform the way riders thought about travel, but its influence deepened as the machine matured. By the late 1970s, the Gold Wing was no longer just a curiosity. It had become the backbone of a growing subculture of long-haul riders who saw motorcycles not as weekend toys, but as tools for true cross-country adventures. That distinction raised the stakes. If a bike could reliably carry someone across thousands of miles, what else could it achieve? Riders began to test the GL1000's limits, and Honda started paying close attention to how people actually use the machine. The insights from those miles would define the next chapter. Microstory. A pair of riders from the Midwest decided to ride their GL1000s to the Rockies, a trip that meant tackling harsh winds, steep climbs, and unpredictable weather. Where other motorcycles often broke down or left their riders exhausted, the Gold Wings pressed on, their liquid cooling and shaft drive proving reliable against the elements. By the time the pair returned home, they had spread word of a motorcycle that could handle America's toughest terrain without complaint. Stories like these turned the Gold Wing into more than a purchase. It became an entry into a lifestyle of confidence and endurance. Context Digest. Touring culture in the US had often been fragmented before the GL1000. Some riders tried to modify cruisers with bolt-on fairings, while others adapted sport machines with makeshift luggage. The Gold Wing brought a level of coherence, a single platform that could support the accessories and expectations of a long-distance tourer. This sense of reliability encouraged more riders to think big. Cross-state trips, coast-to-coast journeys, and eventually even international expeditions. Honda hadn't just built a motorcycle, it had given riders permission to dream bigger. Reflection Bridge. The Gold Wing's real impact wasn't only measured in miles ridden, but in horizons expanded. Microstory. In Florida, a retired couple used their GL1000 as their ticket to see the country. Unlike their car, the motorcycle gave them a sense of immersion in the landscape, smelling the orange groves, feeling the salt air from the coast, and watching the land change mile by mile. What shocked their friends wasn't just that they were traveling on a motorcycle, but that they could do it comfortably at their age. The GL1000 had made motorcycling accessible to demographics once thought unlikely to embrace two wheels. That widening of the rider base strengthened Honda's position in the American market, as the Gold Wing quietly redefined who could belong on the open road. Context Digest. The design language of the GL1000 began to signal future intentions. Its flat-four engine layout suggested stability and room for growth, while the frame and driveline hinted at the capacity to support more weight and more amenities. Rival manufacturers noticed, but none could immediately match the balance Honda achieved. Riders saw it too, realizing that their GL1000 was not only a machine for today, but a foundation for tomorrow. That perception gave the Gold Wing an aura of longevity, a sense that buying one wasn't just about a ride, but about joining a long journey ahead. Microstory. On a rainy night ride in the Pacific Northwest, a group of Gold Wing owners found themselves outlasting other riders who had pulled off the road. The GL1000's stable handling, smooth delivery of power, and ability to carry protective gear kept them moving forward. By dawn, they had covered hundreds of miles while others sat waiting for weather to clear. That endurance earned them respect in local circles and proved that the Gold Wing wasn't fragile. It was a workhorse disguised in refinement. Reflection Bridge. In practice, the Gold Wing GL1000 was doing more than taking riders places. It was reshaping the very idea of what a motorcycle journey could mean. Context digest. By the time the 1980s arrived, the Gold Wing community was vibrant and unmistakable. Dedicated rallies began to dot the American map, with gatherings in towns that suddenly found themselves hosting hundreds of gleaming machines. These weren't rowdy biker takeovers, but organized, family-friendly events where riders compared mileage, gear, and travel stories. The GL1000 had inspired not just riders, but entire families to see the motorcycle as a vehicle for adventure rather than rebellion. That cultural pivot carried weight, reshaping how the broader public viewed motorcycling. The Gold Wing was no longer a novelty, it was an institution. And with that status came the question of legacy. Would it remain a niche, or would it evolve into a permanent cornerstone of American motorcycling? The answer lay in the decades to come, when the GL1000's blueprint would evolve into something even larger. The Suzuki Katana GSX 1100S, once derided and celebrated in equal measure, eventually crossed the line from controversy into legend. By the late 1980s and beyond, it was no longer just a divisive new model. It had become a symbol of daring, a reference point whenever motorcyclists talked about design risks. That transformation is one of the most fascinating parts of its story, because it shows how time can turn shock into reverence. Micro story. As the years passed, the Suzuki Katana GSX 1100S gained a cult following that few motorcycles achieve. Owners who had kept theirs found that strangers would stop to ask about it, recalling the stir it caused back in the day. Collectors began to view it as a piece of industrial art, not just a machine. What once was called ugly now was called unique, and values started to climb. This wasn't just nostalgia. It was recognition that the Katana had changed the language of motorcycles forever. Context digest. In the broader motorcycle market, the Katana GSX 1100S helped open the door for manufacturers to experiment more boldly. By the 1990s, angular lines and integrated fairings were the norm, and sport bikes wore their aggression proudly. The Katana didn't single-handedly create this trend, but it validated the idea that the public would eventually embrace radical styling. Without it, many later icons might have looked far more conservative. Micro story. The Katana GSX 1100S also became a touchstone in pop culture. It appeared in advertisements, films, and posters, its blade-like silhouette instantly recognizable. For a generation raised in the 1980s, it became one of the defining visual markers of the decade, sitting alongside wedge-shaped cars and neon-lit cityscapes. Even people who never rode a motorcycle could recognize the Katana as a symbol of the era's boldness. Its design had transcended motorcycling and entered the larger cultural imagination. Reflection bridge. What once was mocked as excess now read as vision. Micro story. As the motorcycle industry entered the 2000s, Suzuki revisited the Katana name in various forms, but none carried the same disruptive shock as the original GSX 1100S. Still, each revival proved how much weight the Katana brand carried. Every time Suzuki unveiled a new Katana, the conversation inevitably circled back to the original, proving that its influence was indelible. It wasn't just a bike you could copy, it was a moment in time you could never truly recreate, and that made the first Katana even more precious in the eyes of enthusiasts. Context digest. For riders in the US, the Katana GSX 1100S held a particularly interesting place. Imported in limited numbers, it quickly developed a reputation as an exotic sight on American roads. While other bikes of the period were common, the Katana turned heads, making its owners feel like they were part of a select group. That exclusivity helped burnish its legacy stateside, where rarity often adds to mystique. Micro story. Today, when collectors and enthusiasts discuss the great motorcycles of the 20th century, the Suzuki Katana GSX 1100S is consistently mentioned, not just for performance but for the audacity of its design. Museums display it as an example of daring industrial creativity. Riders who own restored examples find themselves as stewards of history, preserving a machine that once divided opinions but now unites admirers. It has become a reminder that the boldest ideas often need time to be understood. Reflection bridge. In the end, the Katana's real achievement was proving that difference itself could become timeless. Micro story. Legacy is never guaranteed in motorcycling. Plenty of bikes have come and gone without leaving a mark. The Suzuki Katana GSX 1100S endures because it wasn't afraid to challenge the rules and because it embodied the spirit of an era that valued looking forward. It set a precedent for bravery and design that still resonates whenever a new, controversial motorcycle hits the market. Riders may not realize it, but every time they argue over a polarizing new model, they are reliving the same debate sparked by the Katana. That is the mark of a true icon. And with that, we can now pull the story together, considering what it all means for riders today and why the Katana's lessons still matter. The story of the Honda Gold Wing GL1000 is more than a tale of engineering success. It is the blueprint for an entirely new way of thinking about motorcycles in America. When it first arrived in 1975, few could have predicted that a quiet, refined machine would grow into the cornerstone of a cultural shift. Yet the GL1000 proved that comfort, reliability, and distance could be just as compelling as raw speed or rebellious style. Its flat-4 engine, liquid cooling, and shaft drive were more than technical features. They were promises to riders that fatigue didn't have to be part of the journey. Those promises became the foundation of an entire touring segment that thrives to this day. In practical terms, the GL1000 showed Americans that a motorcycle could be a true alternative to the automobile for long-distance travel. Families packed luggage, retirees planned coast-to-coast rides, and clubs organized rallies that spanned states rather than city blocks. Ownership of a Gold Wing became synonymous with the idea of freedom measured not in bursts of adrenaline, but in miles accumulated without pain or breakdowns. This broadened the audience for motorcycling, welcoming riders who might otherwise have dismissed two wheels as impractical or uncomfortable. The Gold Wing did not replace other motorcycle cultures. It complemented them, proving that the riding world could be bigger, richer, and more diverse. For American buyers, the GL1000 also reshaped dealership floors. It stood as a premium choice that justified its cost through durability and trust, drawing in customers who often stayed loyal for life. Its legacy as a dependable companion meant resale values held strong, and its aftermarket ecosystem flourished. To own one was to invest in both a machine and a community, and that reality made the GL1000 not just a product, but a cultural landmark. The impact still resonates today. Every touring motorcycle on the market, no matter the manufacturer, carries echoes of the questions first asked in 1975. How far can it go? How comfortably can it carry? And how reliably can it deliver? Those standards exist because the GL1000 set them. In that sense, the first Gold Wing was not merely a motorcycle, it was a manifesto on two wheels. For those who remember riding one, or for those encountering its story for the first time, the message is the same. The Honda Gold Wing GL1000 showed that the journey doesn't have to be punishing to be profound. It redefined freedom for an entire generation of riders, and in doing so, it left behind a legacy that stretches far beyond its years of production. When we look at the highways today, filled with touring bikes of every shape and size, we are still riding in the wake of the GL1000's revolution. And that is the enduring gift of the Gold Wing, that it made the long road not only possible but desirable.